It's a delight to be in Bristol, and as Jonathan said, we've been privileged to have actually delivered a number of projects here, working with Aldo, who I think is here today. It's also delightful to follow Murray, because he set the scene of, I think, how we try to work in an open-ended, speculative way and deliver research-based projects, which are very often not what the client wants at all. And so much of our practice is about finding strategies and mechanisms to stay in the room long enough to understand what's going on, and in the design of the public realm, by being in that room, to kind of metaphorically wedge the door open, and so those voices that aren't ours can be heard in that brief development of what the public realm should be. More and more, the public realm is now developed by delivered by the private sector. So there's already a tension there, whereas the kind of benign sort of a care that the municipality can be seen to give to a kind of shared space where all its citizens can congregate, as you described in Palestine, by repaving the squares and the roads as the first act of kind of invitation to share this space. Very often, that sense of sharing and that sense of making a space where differences can coexist is not something that developers are keen to do. And so briefs are very often incomplete, but they're not incomplete in a good way. They're not incomplete because they're open-ended. They're incomplete because the brief hasn't been sufficiently developed to understand the nuance of place. And they're also contradictory. They both are aspirational in order to make this unique new place, but they're also very, very risk-averse. And in this quote, which I very much like, from Maria Smith, formerly of Studio Weave, she describes this sort of contradictory ambition to kind of place make in a situation that's risk-averse. And so one ends up being constrained by this anxiety about what change will bring. So I want to talk about this project that we've been working on for a number of years in Croydon, which is a project called Ruskin Square. It's a mixed-use development on a very, very big site next to the railway station, which has been derelict for probably about 15 years while the development package was put together. We were invited to, it's a private developer, Stanhope Schroeder, and we were invited to pitch for the job. And it was just after we'd completed the 2011 pavilion for the Venice Biennale, where we focused very much on Ruskin and Ruskin's legacy. And so we came to the interview with this ambition to imbue the public realm of the development with Ruskin's principles, with his commitment to the idea of a kind of more democratic way that we could coexist with one another through a kind of emancipation, through education, and through the benefit that art and work, when it's meaningful, can bring to the individual. And the developer was seduced by this narrative without, I think, really understanding what we meant. And so we then embarked on this process of the design of the public realm for this mixed-use development in a way that we wanted to use a kind of process of engagement with local people to really find out how this new piece of the city could genuinely be an asset to those people who live in Croydon, over and above the people who are going to directly benefit from kind of either working in the development or being lucky enough to be able to afford to live there. And so we had to use the first stage of the project, and I'm afraid the slide is quite difficult to see, but the first stage of the project is on the left-hand side here, which was to make a new link to the station, and either side of which are the development plots. So the first kind of very small piece of public realm that we made was to make this sort of tiny route and a destination outside the station. And the public realm, it's only about 2,000 square meters, but it was designed as a mountain, which you can see on the far slide over there, using Caithness stone, which is from a place in Scotland where Ruskin spent a lot of time and spent a lot of time drawing. And Ruskin describes kind of mountains as the beginning and the end of nature. And so we wanted to create this place that was both kind of totally constructed and artificial, but which was a kind of open-ended invitation to inhabit this space where we planted mature trees and the rocks were planted, to make a social space that could be appropriated for many different things. And in the middle slide, you can see a kind of impromptu refashioning of it as a crazy golf course during the first summer that it was open. And so the delivery of that project somehow gave the developer confidence that we could actually kind of formally deliver attractive public realm spaces. And so while that was going on, we were then able to focus on the larger development site alongside the station, which at the time, I don't know if you can see, but on the left-hand side of this slide, there was a small independent theatre that was kind of really, really down on its luck. It was a kind of in the last throes of existence, but they did a lot of community outreach work with people who wouldn't normally go to a theatre. And so we made this proposal to open up the pre-development site as a garden, as a brownfield garden, and started off with this inventory of the existing landscape to show that there is a real value, there's a real biodiverse value in those brownfield sites, which are so easily destroyed by development, and worked with Kew Gardens to make that inventory. So it kind of gave it a status. And then we made this temporary garden where, in order to protect that very fragile ecology that you get on brownfield sites, we made this sort of walkway path where you could come through the theatre, and we built them a new lavatory in the process of doing that. You come through the theatre into the garden, and then there was a series of kind of breakout spaces, if you like, in the garden that were made using very, very cheap, simple materials, the kind of materials that you get on building sites to enclose scaffolding. So there was a multi-use games area, and we also built, 2 cricket nets. And the cricket nets were built because, as part of our research, we came to understand that because Luna House is the place where you have to go in the south of England to register when you come in as a refugee, there were a lot of unaccompanied, mainly young men from Afghanistan and various other places in Croydon with absolutely nothing to do, because when you have that status, you can't work. And a lot of them were spending their time not doing anything at all. So the idea was to build the cricket net so that they could go out and do cricket practice. And we made the project with the Refugee Council, so they had the key to get to the garden. And they ran over 2 summers a whole series of outreach work with these young men and brought them to the garden. And the interesting sort of social engineering that happened is when the Refugee Council weren't using the cricket nets, the people who worked in the offices, white-collar workers, used the cricket nets. And so it brought together these 2 very different constituencies of kind of white, middle-class men alongside these much, much younger boys, finding this common ground through cricket. So kind of for a moment there was this sort of rehearsal almost of what it means to make a public space where kind of different constituencies can come together in a way where both of them find that pleasure in use of the public space. And the kind of process of making the garden was also a process of kind of expanding the territory of the theatre. And so the theatre then made a series of experimental productions in the garden where the audience became the commuters on the balcony from the station overlooking the garden. And so again, it was about making this moment where the public realm became this kind of activated, if you like, by the activities of the theatre, and became a focus for the imagination, and enabled again that rehearsal for public space to be a place where kind of the imagination is given a generous space as much as kind of the physical occupation is. And we ran a whole series of kind of workshops over the summer in collaboration with Chelsea Fringe, which were all to do with exploring the fauna and the flora of the garden, and so ran drawing workshops with local children. And so that whole sort of open-ended brief development about what this space could be, our aspiration was that that would feed into the design of the permanent space that was to come. And to a certain extent, the client was sensitized to that and became kind of much more open towards making a space where there was generous provision for people to hang around, and there was a sense that it was more than just the kind of iconic forecourt, the sort of doormat to their buildings. And so as we went through the process of designing the square that was to come on that site, we were then asked to manage the process of delivering a work of public art for the square, and there was a budget of about £100,000 to do that. And again, we used that as an opportunity to make this open-ended process of engaging with local people in Croydon. And so we made the proposal to the client that we would take Ruskin's kind of quote where he talks about that the value of work is not what you get for it, but what you become by it, and that we would work with young, unemployed people in Croydon, and we would create a structure where we could engage in a creative process with them as a kind of parallel and alternative to the process that they have to go through when you're young and unemployed now, where there's a kind of almost meaningless process of form filling and going to interviews that are completely irrelevant maybe to your interests. And one of the reasons we wanted to do this is because we felt very keenly as a generation who'd grown up where being unemployed was almost like having a grant to be creative. That doesn't exist now for that generation. And there's a real sense of like, where is the next generation of creative energy going to come from if you can't afford to go to college, if you can't afford to be poor? How are you going to make that space to explore what it is you really care about? And how are you going to make that space to nurture your creativity in a way that's relevant to you? So we made this proposal to the client, who was very, very dubious about it, that we would create what we called this Festival of Toil, which would be action research on the site to demonstrate the kind of hidden assets of the site. And then we'd organise a dinner debate where we would invite the decision makers in Croydon, people from the local council, as well as the developer, as well as local artists, to come together and through that discussion to formulate the brief for what the public art should be. And so the process we proposed was that we'd use the soil that was being dug out the site, and this is in London, so it's clay soil, to actually make clay and then to make a clay oven to cook the food for the dinner debate. And we would smelt the waste aluminium off the site to make the cutlery to eat the food. And so we began that process, and over about a period of 3 months, we worked with about 4 young men. There's 3 of them here. And we paid them. We had they were on the living London wage to work with us over that period of time, to dry the soil, to pulverise it, to drain the water out, then to remix it into clay, and then to make the oven. And at the end of that process, we had a day on site which we called the Festival of Toil, where we cooked on the oven, where we smelted the aluminium, and we made with them 2 grinding machines from bicycles where we polished. We didn't actually make forks. We made something called a spork, because that was using crude open casting was the shape that we could afford to. The technology we were using, which was very low technology, we could afford to make. So here's the giant pair of bellows we made. There's the foundry made out of a dustbin. And there's the polishing bicycles. And it became both a kind of process of production, but also it was framing the kind of the theatre of production, the theatre of work for the commuters that used the station and walked past this site. And so there's details of that process going on. And there was a fortuitous moment when a group of school children who'd just come back from the Museum of London passed by, and then Adil and TJ and Osama were able to talk to them about what they were doing. And the young men that we'd worked for then took complete ownership of the process, and they made these sort of jackets to wear so they could differentiate themselves kind of in the public realm as kind of producers of artifacts as well as ideas during that one day. And then this is images from the dinner debate where that we organised, where the cooking, part of the cooking was done in the clay oven and part of the cooking was done by another young man who'd arrived as an unaccompanied refugee who had now become taken on in a hotel kitchen in London. And we invited, as I said, those decision makers and had a chaired debate. And through that, the brief came out for the piece of public art, which was to be something, I mean, in a way, what was quite difficult was the kind of the brief remained, if you like, part of the action research. So the brief kind of made this decision that the art should be open-ended and should continue to engage in the way that this process has, which was obviously very difficult for the client to take on because they wanted a kind of object bit of art to put in their development. But a sort of offshoot from the whole process was that one of the people we invited to the dinner was the curator of architecture at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and he then made an offer to Adil and Osama that they should come to the museum with the sporks that they'd made, and they would become part of the Ruskin collection. And so that was a really powerful way of kind of like recognizing the value of what they'd done and kind of embedding it in a kind of cultural institution, so giving a real status to their contribution that they'd made to this development. So then the developer put the brief out to open call, which we tried to persuade him not to, and we made this suicidal proposal for the public art for the Ruskin Square, which we were the developers of the public realm of, which was that they should, in the way that all cities now are not only in competition with each other, but even neighborhoods within cities are now in competition for inward investment. And the kind of mechanism that cities use to differentiate themselves in that competition for global investment is to build iconic buildings and to have kind of iconic places, which leads to the situation that every city is kind of different in exactly the same way. And so our proposal was rather than having a kind of iconic object, was to have a kind of radical approach to sustaining a place. And so the proposal was that they should build, that they should buy a pair of peacocks as iconic objects to put into the development, which would probably cost them about £50, and that they should spend the rest of the £100,000 on a bursary for a student to go to the local agricultural college, which is down the road in Crystal Palace, and that part of that money would then be spent on looking after those peacocks and bringing them to the square every week for one day every week. As you can imagine, the developer just couldn't cope with that at all, so he didn't get the job. But I think the process that we went through with the developer kind of challenged them to kind of engage with us around that idea of a building and kind of has an impact on more than the envelope within which it sits, and that sense of how they could sort of continue that commitment to making places that were open-ended. And Osama and Adil and TJ and Malachi all then went on to get apprenticeships, some of them working on this development and some of them working on another project that we're working in Croydon. And unfortunately, one of them wants to become an architect now. This last project is a project that operates in a similar way to the work that we did in Ruskin Square, and it was working with an institution, working with the Victoria and Albert Museum. And we were commissioned as part of the exhibition that they put on leading up to the last election, which was called All This Belongs to You. And the proposition was that the collection in the V&A is a national collection, so essentially all of us own it. And so we took this proposition as a way to explore what an institution, a cultural institution like the V&A is as a public space, and how the kind of the care and the bylaws that control what you can and can't do in this very, very rarefied public space, where the aim is to care for the artifacts within the museum, how that could be a template almost for a set of bylaws for kind of public space outside the institution. So we began by testing what was possible within that place, and we organised for the the Women's Refugee Group, which is a charity that works with women refugees, teaching them English and kind of finding a way to support them through that process of becoming legal in the country, to have their English classes at the V&A. And the process of doing that sort of uncovered all of the kind of difficulties that an institution has that's about caring for artifacts with caring for people. And so what the kind of infrastructure that was needed to allow people to inhabit that space became the brief. And so the first invitation of bringing the women to the museum then led to the design of a series of pieces of furniture where the edges of the furniture had soft edges so that where they rubbed up against the artifacts, they didn't abrade the artifacts. And so making it possible for people who have probably very little access to kind of quality spaces to be able to come to the museum and spend time in the museum and use the museum as their living room or their office. And we also hung the patchwork quilts that the women had made up on the wall as a temporary exhibition next to, and you cannot see this in this slide, but it's next to an artifact which is called the Misericordia, which is the Virgin Mary holding a cloak open and all the poor and oppressed are kind of underneath her cloak. And we then identified these two objects in the museum, one of which was the Misericordia, and the other one of which was a statue in the same room. And we went back to the original site of both of those artifacts to see how the buildings from which they'd been taken had been repurposed. And both of those buildings were different types of community centre in Italy. And so on the left here, this is where that statue came from, the empty niche, which is in the grounds of a house called Villa Bracci. And Villa Bracci is now a social centre for older people who live in the area, because that area of Italy has become depopulated and it has a very imbalanced population, so a lot of old people and not very many young people. And so we used part of the funding for the project to organise a series of social events at the Villa Bracci and then photographed those and brought them back to the museum. And we called that reverse restitution. How can the place from which these artifacts have come kind of be kind of reinvested in by the museum, and how can there be a kind of a sense of value in both the artifact and the kind of social infrastructure that continues to exist in those places where they've come from. Then the next stage of the project was to take the qualities of the public space of the museum and to see where they could be found in the public realm. And so this was one of the sort of pieces of action research we did, where we identified Tower Hamlets Cemetery, which is this beautiful space of kind of these sculptural tombstones that's kind of fallen into disrepair because it has no development value. It only has value as a cemetery, and somehow that's protected it and made it into this incredibly rarefied and beautiful space. And so we set up a series of drawing and modelling classes with the girls from Central Foundation School, which is just down the road, to bring them to the cemetery to engage in a kind of rarefied act of sort of cultural production in the cemetery. So this is the life drawing class, and this was the modelling class in the cemetery. And then again, those images were photographed, and then they went back into the museum, and that formed the beginning of the brief for the next stage of the project that we're working on with the V&A, and that the V&A is now making an outpost in East London as part of occupying the Olympic site. And the brief that's come out of that work that we did with them is how to make the museum a kind of relevant place for those people in that neighbourhood who probably haven't been to the parent institution in South Kensington. And what is it about the museum? Is it just about the artifacts, or is it about that kind of that envelope of care as a public space that the museum can extend to the neighbourhood? Thank you.